In a city where fate seldom gives second chances, a single glance under flickering streetlights ignites a quiet revolution. The rain had been relentless all evening, washing the tired city streets in a blur of shimmering reflections. Claire held her baby close, the fragile warmth of the tiny body pressed against her chest like a whispered prayer. Her breath came in shallow bursts. The hospital's machines had whispered grim numbers again today. Her son, Leo, was hanging by the thinnest of threads, and every hope seemed to dissolve with the pattering storm outside. She hurried down the slick pavement, her coat barely shielding them from the cold. The weight of exhaustion tugged at her limbs, but desperation fueled her steps. At the corner of a dimly lit street, she collided with a figure stepping out of the shadows, an older man with a face etched by battles, both seen and unseen. His eyes, sharp yet soft, caught hers in that sudden electric moment. "I'm sorry," Claire whispered, steadying herself against his steady frame. The man's gaze didn't waver, something calm and solid anchoring her panic. "It's all right," he replied quietly, voice rough but gentle. "Are you okay? You look like you're carrying the whole world." The truth in her eyes spilled out before she could stop it. "My baby's very sick," she said, voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer. I'm trying to get to the hospital." He nodded slowly, a flash of understanding passing through his eyes, as if he'd known hardship too intimately to need explanations. "I'm Jake," he said, extending a weathered hand. "I was in the service. Came back a little broken." Claire glanced down at her baby, then back up to Jake's steady gaze. There was something about his presence, quiet strength, a kind of rugged gentleness, that made her heart flutter despite the ache that clawed inside. "I'm Claire, and this is Leo." She smiled weakly, almost ashamed to smile at all. But in that rain-slicked street corner, under the trembling neon glow, something fragile and hopeful sparked between them. A connection born not from words but from shared wounds and unspoken promises. Jake offered her his coat without a word, draping it over her shoulders like a shield. As the rain continued to fall, the two strangers, each carrying their own battles, began a journey neither could have foreseen, one where healing might just find a way in the most unlikely of places. In the quiet spaces between heartbeats, two souls begin to weave a fragile thread, delicate secrets shared beneath the hush of twilight. Days slipped by, each one folding into the next like pages in a worn book. Claire found herself returning to the hospital, where Leo's fragile breaths measured the passing hours. Jake was there too, more often than she expected, sitting quietly in the corner of the sterile waiting room, his presence a calm anchor against the storm swirling inside her. Their conversations were tentative at first, simple words exchanged over lukewarm coffee or whispered beneath the buzz of fluorescent lights. Jake shared fragments of his past, stories wrapped in silence and shadow. The war zones, the loss, the nights when sleep refused to come. Claire listened, offering nothing but her attentive presence, the softness of her gaze an unspoken balm to his worn soul. For Claire, Jake became a quiet refuge. She could lean on him when the world felt too heavy, when fear clawed at her chest and hope flickered like a candle in a gale. One evening, as she cradled Leo, who had finally rested peacefully for the first time in days, Jake reached out, his calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Your strength. It's something else," he murmured, voice low and steady. "Not just for Leo, but for you. I've seen a lot in my life, but you fight like hell." Claire's lips curved into a fragile smile, the kind born from exhaustion, but also from something deeper. Connection, maybe even trust. It was the first time she allowed herself to imagine a world beyond the hospital walls, a world where pain didn't rule every moment. In those stolen hours, they discovered quiet joys, shared laughter over silly mistakes, soft confessions under a tapestry of stars when the night shifted from cold to hopeful. Jake showed her the small miracles in everyday things, a fresh cup of coffee, a gentle touch, a walk through rain-wet streets that felt less lonely with him by her side. Little by little, the bond between them grew, shaped by whispered secrets and silent understanding. Claire saw Jake's scars, not just the ones etched on his skin, but the ones hidden deep inside. and found herself wanting to heal him as much as she wished for her son's survival. One rainy afternoon, as Leo slept peacefully against her chest, Jake took Claire's hand in his. "We don't have to face this alone," he said softly. "Whatever happens, I'm here." And in that simple promise, something inside Claire shifted. For the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel like a fragile dream. It felt real, steady, like the quiet pulse of a heart beginning to heal. Beneath the fragile calm, shadows stir, whispers of truths long buried, ready to shake the ground beneath their fragile trust. Claire had always been a fortress, unyielding, fiercely protective of her little family. But the deeper her connection with Jake grew, the more she realized how much she'd kept locked away, even from herself. One evening, as the city hummed quietly outside the hospital window, that fortress began to crack. Jake had just returned from a late walk, bringing with him the sharp scent of rain and earth. He sat beside her quietly, eyes distant, as if wrestling with ghosts only he could see. Claire's heart tightened. "Jake, what's wrong?" she asked softly. He sighed, shoulders heavy. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, voice low, trembling like a secret about to break free. "Back when I came home, it wasn't just the war I was fighting. I lost more than I can explain." Claire reached out, her hand steadying his trembling fingers. She wanted him to know it was safe to speak. Jake swallowed hard. "I've been running from this for years. PTSD, yeah. But there's more. I was involved in something I didn't want anyone to know. Things I'm not proud of." Her breath hitched, a storm of questions rushing through her mind. "What thing?" she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of machines. Jake's eyes locked onto hers, raw and searching. "I was part of an operation that went wrong. Innocent people got hurt. I tried to protect them, but it wasn't enough. I carry their faces with me every day." Claire felt a pang of pain, not just for him, but for the burden he bore alone for so long. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I didn't want you to see me as broken," he admitted, his voice cracking. "And you have enough to deal with already." Then, gathering her courage, Claire shared her own secret, a whispered confession she'd never voiced aloud. "Leo's condition, it's rare. We don't know if he'll make it. The doctors have tried everything." Jake's hand tightened around hers, a fierce protectiveness sparking in his eyes. "We'll fight this, together." That night, as the city slipped into silence, they laid bare their wounds, the secrets, the fears, the scars that had shaped them. In that vulnerable honesty, a fragile but powerful trust took root. For the first time, they weren't just two broken souls side by side. They were allies, ready to face the uncertain future hand in hand. When hearts collide with conflicting dreams, even the strongest bonds tremble on the edge of breaking. Days grew heavier with the weight of uncertainty, and the fragile peace Claire and Jake had built began to crack under the strain. Leo's health remained precarious, each hospital visit a trial that tested Claire's resolve. Meanwhile, Jake's past shadowed every step, a restless storm refusing to quiet. One chilly afternoon, they sat in the cramped hospital waiting room, the sterile smell wrapping around them like a cold reminder of all they couldn't control. Claire's voice was tight, worn thin from sleepless nights and the pressure to keep hope alive. "I'm doing everything I can for Leo," she said, her eyes pleading. "But maybe I need to start thinking about what happens if things don't get better." Jake's jaw clenched. "You can't think like that," he said sharply. "We don't give up. Not now. Not ever." Claire flinched at the edge in his tone. "It's not about giving up. It's about being realistic. We have to face what's best for him, even if it's hard." He shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. "You're shutting me out. I'm here, Claire. I want to help, but you push me away every time I try." Her chest tightened, tears pricking behind her lashes. "I'm scared, Jake. Scared of losing him. Scared of losing you." The air between them thickened, a painful silence hanging like a curtain. For the first time, the distance between them felt vast, filled with unspoken fears and conflicting wills. Later, Jake found himself pacing outside the hospital, the city's bustle indifferent to the turmoil inside his chest. He knew Claire was fighting her own battles, but the weight of his secrets and her desperation seemed to be driving a wedge between them. When he returned, their eyes met, both searching, both wounded. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered. "But if we can't be honest with each other, how do we survive this?" Claire looked away, the tears finally spilling free. "Maybe we can't." That night, as Leo slept in a fragile slumber, the two stood on opposite sides of a growing chasm. The love that had blossomed amid pain now faced its harshest test. Whether it could endure when hope faltered and hearts struggled to stay aligned. When silence replaces certainty, even love begins to feel like a question with no answer. Claire sat in the dim hospital room, barely moving, her fingers tracing the curve of Leo's tiny hand. The monitors beeped in rhythm with her breath, slow, shallow, uncertain. Her son's face was pale, almost translucent, and the doctors had spoken in careful tones that day. Words like declining and options running out, lingering like smoke in her mind. She hadn't seen Jake in nearly 2 days. He had left quietly after their argument, leaving only a folded note on the windowsill. "I didn't want to say the wrong thing again. I just want to help. I hope you'll let me." She had read it a dozen times but still couldn't bring herself to answer. Everything felt like it was unraveling. The strength Claire once carried like armor now felt brittle, paper thin. Her courage was slipping. What if Leo didn't make it? What if Jake, this man who had become the only soul who understood her pain, was already halfway out the door? She pressed her forehead gently against the side of Leo's bed, whispering, "I don't know what to do anymore, baby. I don't know how to save you, and I don't know how to keep from losing him too." Meanwhile, Jake stood outside the hospital's entrance, the weight of his own guilt pressing on him like the thick gray sky above. He replayed their fight again and again, how his frustration had spilled into words he couldn't take back, how he'd pushed instead of listened. He had faced enemy fire. He had seen men die in his arms, but nothing had ever made him feel more helpless than watching Claire cry and knowing he was part of the reason. "You don't belong in her world," a voice inside him whispered. "She needs someone whole, someone who doesn't wake up screaming in the dark." He considered leaving, disappearing like a chapter in a story she could quietly close. But the thought of Claire alone, the sound of Leo's fragile breaths, and the echo of her laugh when she still believed in better days, they anchored him. Back in the room, Claire sat upright as a nurse stepped in. "Still stable," the nurse said kindly, "but it's hour by hour now." Claire nodded, her throat tightening. "Thank you." After the nurse left, she looked toward the window, half hoping Jake would be there, half fearing he wouldn't. Because when love is no longer certain, when fear drowns out everything else, sometimes the deepest ache isn't in what's lost. It's in not knowing whether to hold on or let go. Even in the deepest night, a single flicker, a whispered word, a gentle hand, can remind the heart how to believe again. Claire didn't expect to see him again. Not so soon, not in that moment when her hope was hanging by threads. She had spent the past day moving like a ghost, caring for Leo with the mechanical efficiency of someone too afraid to fall apart. But that evening, as the sun spilled faint gold across the window pane, Jake walked back into the room. No grand entrance, no dramatic speech, just quiet steps, a bouquet of pale daisies in his hand. Simple, hopeful things. Claire blinked, stunned for a moment. "You came back." Jake nodded, his voice low and steady. "I was never gone, just trying to figure out how not to mess it up." She looked at him, really looked at him, eyes a little heavier, beard a little more unkempt, but still him. Still the man who had held her when she couldn't hold herself together. He walked over and gently placed the flowers on the windowsill beside Leo's bed. Then without a word, he sat beside her. Their hands touched, just barely, but the warmth spread like sunlight over frost. "I kept thinking," he murmured, "if you told me it was over, I'd walk away. But something kept pulling me back. Not just to you, Claire. To him. To this." She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "I was scared. Still am." "Me too," Jake admitted. "But scared doesn't mean we stop showing up." They sat in silence for a while, watching Leo's tiny chest rise and fall. The tension between them had softened, not vanished, but transformed into something gentler, something forged by trial. Later, as the sky turned indigo and nurses changed shifts, Claire leaned her head on Jake's shoulder for the first time in days. "Do you think he can still pull through?" she asked, voice fragile. "I don't know," Jake said, "but I do know he's got you, and that's a hell of a lot." She let out a quiet laugh through her tears. "And you?" He tilted his head slightly, lips brushing her hair. "If you'll let me, I'm in this too, as long as it takes." The road ahead was still uncertain. Leo's condition remained critical. But that night something shifted. Not outside, but within. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a cure. It was just a hand held tighter, a fear shared, a promise rekindled in the quiet, sacred space where broken things begin to heal. In a world full of fragile things, sometimes it's a promise, spoken from a trembling heart, that becomes the strongest bond of all. The rain had returned by morning, soft and rhythmic against the hospital window. Claire sat beside Leo's bed, fingers lightly tracing the edge of his blanket, her lips moving in silent prayer. The monitors still beeped in that unnervingly steady rhythm, but today something in the air felt different, like a held breath slowly being released. Jake stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. The light of early morning caught the edges of her face, painting her not as someone defeated by grief, but as someone rising despite it. He stepped closer, carrying a small box in his hand. Not wrapped, not showy, just something simple, real. She looked up at him, and this time, she didn't have to ask what he was thinking. She could see it in his eyes. He was ready to give her more than comfort. He was ready to give her something that would outlast even the darkest nights. "I've been thinking," Jake began, kneeling beside her chair, the box still untouched in his hand. "There's a lot I don't have. I don't have guarantees. I don't have all the answers. But I've got something worth offering." Claire's breath caught. "I can't promise we'll never struggle," he continued, "but I can promise I won't walk away. Not when it's hard, not when it's scary, not ever. I want to be here, for him." He gently reached out and touched Leo's tiny foot. "And for you." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes wide and full. "Jake, I don't need grand gestures." "I know," he said. "That's why I brought something small." He opened the box, revealing a single silver ring, worn and modest but engraved on the inside with two words, "Still here." Claire took it in her hand, her fingers trembling. It wasn't about marriage. It wasn't about future plans. It was about presence, about staying, about choosing her and Leo every single day. "I don't know what's ahead," she whispered. "I don't know if Leo's going to make it. And I don't want you to make promises you'll regret." Jake reached up and cupped her face gently, his voice barely more than a breath. "I'm not promising perfection. I'm promising presence. I'll stand beside you, even if we fall. Especially if we fall." She leaned into his touch, the tears slipping down freely now. And as she slipped the ring onto her finger, she felt something take root. Not just love, but a vow. A bond carved not in certainty, but in courage. That day, surrounded by machines and shadows and rain, they didn't say forever. They said something better. "I choose you, even now, even here." Sometimes joy doesn't knock. It bursts in, uninvited, unexplainable, and exactly when it's needed most. The hospital room had become a world of waiting, a limbo of beeping monitors, whispered updates, and sleepless hours. Claire and Jake had learned to find solace in the smallest things. The way Leo's eyelashes fluttered, the way his chest rose and fell like fragile tides, the way the nurses began to smile a little more as they passed. But no one expected the moment when the impossible cracked open, letting joy pour through. It began with a sound, so soft Claire almost missed it, a raspy, tiny cough. Then a cry. Claire bolted upright, her heart pounding. Jake, who had just returned with coffee, dropped the cups on the counter and rushed to her side. Leo was crying, weak but unmistakably alive. His tiny fingers curled, his chest moved with intention. A nurse dashed in, alerted by the monitor's shift. Then another, and then the doctor, the one with too many careful words and tired eyes, entered, blinking in disbelief. He's breathing more independently, the doctor murmured. He's trying. Claire covered her mouth, sobbing with relief. Jake wrapped an arm around her shoulders, gripping her tightly as if afraid she'd vanish if he let go. The days that followed were a blur of cautious optimism. Leo's oxygen levels began to hold. He started responding to sounds. His tiny eyes opened. Just once. And even though they were barely more than slits, Claire saw it. She saw him. One night, a week after the breakthrough, Jake surprised Claire by taking her outside to the small hospital courtyard. The air was crisp, the stars faint but steady above. And then he did something neither of them expected. He laughed. It wasn't loud or long, but it was real, joyful, the sound of a man who hadn't laughed in years, remembering how. Claire laughed too, the sound catching in her throat like sunlight breaking through clouds. They sat on a bench under the weak glow of a lamppost, their fingers entwined, shoulders pressed close. For a few stolen minutes, they weren't a veteran and a grieving mother. They were just two people falling into something rare and beautiful. I forgot what this felt like, Jake said quietly. What? She asked. He looked at her, his voice thick with wonder. Hope. This kind of hope. Claire leaned in, her head resting on his shoulder. Me too. In the stillness, she closed her eyes and whispered the words she'd been afraid to say until now. I think he's going to make it. Jake didn't answer right away. He just held her hand tighter. And in that quiet moment under the stars, the ache inside them began to shift. No longer just pain, but the beginning of something far more powerful. Joy. Unexpected. Undeniable. And real. It's not the storms that define a love story, but the choice to stay when the winds refuse to calm. 3 months later, the hospital was behind them, but the hard part wasn't over. Claire had brought Leo home with cautious joy and a binder full of medical instructions. He still needed oxygen support, weekly checkups, careful feeding schedules. But he was home, alive, breathing. Jake had moved into the spare room in Claire's apartment, at first just to help. Temporary, they had said. But neither of them moved his bags. What they didn't say out loud was that living together wasn't the same as surviving together. Jake struggled to find work. His army pension barely covered his own bills, and adjusting to civilian life brought back the echoes of war, triggers he hadn't expected in the quiet moments. The clink of Leo's bottles at 3 a.m. could sometimes send him spiraling into memories he thought he'd buried. Claire, exhausted from caregiving and crushed under financial strain, started to fray. Her patience ran short. Her words grew sharper. The woman who had stood strong through every hospital night now found herself crying over spilled formula and unopened mail. Their once comforting silences turned brittle, their laughs fewer. One night, Claire snapped over something small, Jake forgetting to clean Leo's breathing mask. The fight was quick, hot, and full of words neither meant. Jake left the apartment, slamming the door behind him. He walked the streets for hours, the cold air biting at his skin, voices from the past chasing his every step. He hated that he couldn't be what she needed. He hated how easy it was to run. Claire, back at the apartment, sat in the hallway, knees pulled to her chest as Leo slept in the next room. She hated how alone she still felt, with someone just down the hall. She hated needing help, and more than that, needing him. When Jake returned in the early hours, soaked in rain and guilt, he stood in the doorway, unsure. I'm no good at this, he said quietly. Claire didn't answer. She just walked up to him and pressed her forehead against his chest. I know, she whispered. Neither am I. But I want to be. They stood there wrapped in silence and damp clothing, and the kind of ache that only time teaches. There was no apology, no resolution that night, just the unspoken agreement that love wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. It wasn't convenient. But it was worth staying for. And that was what they did, again and again. They stayed, through night feeds and job rejections, through therapy appointments and exhausted arguments, through Leo's setbacks and victories. Time didn't make things easier, but it made them stronger, not because everything healed perfectly, but because they chose each other anyway. Sometimes a new beginning doesn't come with fireworks, but with quiet, steady steps into a life built by love and earned through struggle. Spring crept in gently that year, buds on the trees outside the apartment, soft sunlight warming the windows, and the hum of everyday life slowly stitching itself into something whole again. Leo, now 6 months old, giggled in his crib, gumming a rubber giraffe and kicking his feet with surprising strength. The oxygen tubes were gone. His cheeks were fuller. His eyes, once dull with illness, now followed Claire and Jake around the room with bright, curious intent. Claire brewed coffee in the kitchen, watching Jake from a distance. He was bouncing Leo in his arms, making silly noises that coaxed laughter from the baby's belly. It was an ordinary moment, but it shimmered with something bigger. Peace. She hadn't felt this way in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Not happiness in a loud, overwhelming way, just a calm rightness. A quiet knowing that they were finally beginning again. Jake had started working part-time at a community woodshop, a job that kept his hands busy and his mind steady. He came home smelling of sawdust and cedar, and sometimes he brought little hand-carved toys for Leo. Once, he shyly presented Claire with a small wooden bird. "I don't know what it is," he'd said, scratching the back of his neck, "but it felt like hope when I made it." She kept it on the windowsill, right where the daisies had once stood. Claire herself had found work from home, copy editing and helping local businesses with newsletters. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her freedom. More importantly, it gave her time. With Leo, with Jake, and with herself. They still argued, they still stumbled, but something had shifted. The fear that used to grip Claire every time Leo coughed had softened into watchfulness, not panic. Jake still had nightmares, but he no longer woke alone. And when one of them faltered, the other was there. Not to fix everything, but to stand beside them. One evening, they took Leo to the park for the first time. Claire pushed the stroller along the gravel path, while Jake carried a blanket and a thermos. They found a spot beneath a blooming dogwood tree, its petals drifting like confetti in the breeze. Claire sat beside Jake, watching Leo try to roll in the grass. "He's strong," Jake said softly. "So are we," Claire replied. They sat in silence, watching their son coo and squirm and live. Really live. The wind stirred around them, not sharp like before, but warm, inviting, a beginning. Not the kind that erases the past, but the kind that grows from it. A life where trauma didn't vanish, but no longer ruled them. A love that didn't pretend to be perfect, just true. Claire reached for Jake's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Let's keep going," she said. Jake looked at her, eyes full. "Yeah," he whispered. "Let's." And just like that, under the soft pink sky and the laughter of their child, they stepped fully into the life they never thought they'd have. Together. When love demands everything, it doesn't always ask permission. It simply stands at the door and waits to see who will stay. The diagnosis came without warning. Leo had been doing so well, crawling, babbling, even taking his first shaky steps. Claire had just filmed him wobbling across the living room carpet, arms outstretched like a tiny explorer. Jake had laughed so hard he cried. Then came the fever, the labored breathing, the late-night trip to the ER. It was a relapse, rare, aggressive, and terrifying. A dormant infection, awakened like a shadow from the past. Claire sat in the pediatric ICU again, hands clasped, watching tubes snake around her son's small body. She had promised herself they'd never be here again. That once was enough. Jake stood quietly beside her, his face unreadable, but his fingers trembled as he adjusted Leo's blanket. The doctors spoke in hushed voices outside the room. Words like experimental, high risk, and not guaranteed floated through the air like smoke. One treatment stood out, a cutting-edge therapy with a chance of working, but it came with a terrifying condition. Leo's best shot at survival would require a stem cell transplant, a match, a donor. Jake offered his blood before anyone asked. He was a match, but the procedure wouldn't be simple. Given his military history, injuries, and physical trauma, donating would put him at serious risk. The doctors warned of complications, pain, a possible flare-up of his past wounds, both physical and psychological. Claire begged him to reconsider. "I can't lose you too," she whispered, gripping his shirt like a lifeline. Jake cupped her face, leaning his forehead against hers. You won't. You don't have to do this. We'll find someone else. There has to be someone else. There isn't, Jake said softly. And even if there were, I wouldn't let anyone else do it. He's my son too. It was the first time he'd said it out loud. Claire wept, not from fear, but from the unbearable love packed into those 5 words. The day of the procedure came. Jake was wheeled into one wing of the hospital while Leo lay sedated in another. Claire stood between them, holding her breath, praying with every fiber of her being that love would be enough. The hours passed like centuries. Jake came out pale, racked with pain, but alive. He gave a thumbs up through gritted teeth before slipping into restless sleep. Leo's body accepted the cells. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to matter, enough to hope. Jake spent the next few days barely able to sit up, but every time Leo stirred in his crib, Jake would ask, "Is he okay?" Every single time. Claire stayed by both their beds, her warrior and her child, watching as one gave everything so the other could live. She realized then, love isn't what you say when things are good. It's what you give when it might break you. And Jake had given everything. Every song of love has its crescendos and silences, but in the end, it's the harmony that lingers, echoing long after the final note. A full year had passed. The calendar on the fridge showed a line of bright stickers, doctor's visits, therapy days, Leo's second birthday. Each one marked not just a date, but a victory, a small miracle. Claire stood at the back porch of their new home, a modest rental outside town, with creaky floors and a wildflower garden Jake had started from scratch. Leo was napping inside, the baby monitor crackling softly on the kitchen table. And Jake? He was in the backyard, hammering together a makeshift tree swing beneath a tall oak. He worked slowly now, his body still recovering from the donation, still dealing with flare-ups of chronic pain. But he smiled more, and when he caught Claire watching him, he winked. There was a rhythm to their life now. Not perfect, not effortless, but steady. Claire went back inside and tiptoed into Leo's room. He was asleep, one hand clutching the wooden bird Jake had carved. The same bird that once sat on her windowsill during the worst of it all. Its wings were chipped. The beak was a little crooked, but it had endured, and so had they. Later that evening, after dinner and bath time and bedtime stories, Claire and Jake sat on the couch in the quiet. No crisis, no machines. Just them. A love forged through fire, now resting in the coal's warm afterglow. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter, creased, worn, and sealed. He handed it to Claire with a nod. "What is it?" she asked, startled. He smiled gently. "It's the letter I wrote to Leo the night I thought I might not wake up, after the transplant." Her breath caught. "You never gave it to him." "I didn't need to. He lived. But I think you should read it now." Claire opened the envelope and read Jake's shaky, scrawled handwriting. "Dear Leo, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there. But I need you to know, you changed me. You made me believe in staying, in fighting. You are not the reason I gave something up. You're the reason I became whole. Love, Dad." Claire blinked away tears, her hand pressed against her lips. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope, holding it against her chest. "I think," she whispered, "we're going to be okay." Jake leaned his head against hers, closing his eyes. "We already are." Outside, the wind stirred the swing gently, and fireflies blinked through the garden. The world didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. But in this little corner of it, a soldier found peace, a mother found strength, a child found life, and love, once shattered, found its harmony. Together they had not simply survived. They had become a family. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales.